Hello and welcome to It's a Code U, mental health support for those working in healthcare. This is a podcast created for healthcare employees to explore not only issues relating to mental and emotional health, but also unique challenges that those working in healthcare are faced with. Your hosts are Adina Tucker, a licensed clinical social worker with Dartmouth Health, and Jennifer Hinsey, an MSW also with Dartmouth Health. Hello and welcome to It's a Code U. Today we're talking about something that seems really simple, but a lot of people struggle with it. However, it's absolutely foundational to good mental health and great relationships, knowing how you feel. Have you ever said, "I'm fine," when you're anything but? Have you ever felt so overwhelmed that you couldn't even begin to explain what was going on inside you? That's not just frustrating, it can deeply affect the way we communicate, make decisions, and relate to the people we care about most. So, in today's episode, we'll explore what it really means to identify your emotions, why this skill is so important for communication, how emotional awareness impacts your relationships, and practical ways you can build this skill, no matter where you're starting from.
So let's begin with the foundational question. What does it actually mean to identify an emotion? Now, most people can tell you if they feel good or bad, but emotional identification goes a lot deeper than that. It's about being able to distinguish between, let's say, irritation, frustration, and resentment, or between sadness, loneliness, and shame. Psychologists call this emotional granularity, and this is a term that was made popular by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. Emotional granularity is our ability to put very specific labels on our emotions. The more precise our emotional vocabulary, the better our brain is at regulating emotions and helping us respond rather than to react. And this isn't just a theory. According to a 2007 study by Matthew Lieberman and his colleagues, simply labeling a feeling, so saying things like, "I feel anxious," reduces activity in the amygdala. That's the part of our brain that's responsible for fear and emotional reactivity. This activates the prefrontal cortex of our brain, and that can help us feel more in control and less overwhelmed. So that's the neuroscience behind what you probably have heard of before. It's a popular phrase, name it to tame it. And we're going to discuss how to practice name it to tame it towards the end of the episode. Barrett's research also found that people with higher emotional granularity experience less depression. They're better at managing stress and even have stronger immune responses. That's right. Just learning to say, "I feel disappointed," instead of "I feel bad," can actually impact our physical health too. So, identifying our feelings is not just about being more in tune with yourself, it's a whole regulation strategy. It's a relationship tool. It's a life skill. Adina, I'm curious, can you think of a time when you thought you felt one emotion, like anger or sadness, but then when you dug a little deeper, it turned out to be something else?
So, there have been times in life where, I guess it's happened all my life, where maybe you can't tell on this podcast because I actually am able to edit how loud I am. But in real life, I tend to be kind of a loud person. And if I get any sort of emotion that's elevated, whether it's, even just being excited about something or whatever, I will get even louder. I just talk very loud. And as a child, I had a best friend whose father used to call me the mouth of the South. And I feel like also my mother was someone who really cares what other people think and how things look to the outside world. And so it would just be like normal kid stuff, like being silly and whatever, but I was a little loud maybe or whatever. And she would shush me all the time and be like, everyone's looking at you and that kind of thing. So in my adult life, there have been times when, because I don't I guess I don't think about. I'm just like living my life. And I feel like my feeling about things is most people aren't thinking about you. They're not thinking about what you're doing or worrying about what you're doing or judging. They're thinking about their own selves and thinking people are doing that about them. Do you know what I mean? So like I'm just out here in the world being myself. And there have been times where I've been told, like maybe by a partner or a friend, wow, you're talking really loud right now. And it's I think initially the first few times that happened as like a grown up, I felt embarrassed. But then the deeper emotion is like this feeling of shame, like there's something inherently wrong with me as a person, or that like they don't like me and it's cuz so yeah.
Shame is a big one. I feel like if there were a particular emotion that we as mental health providers help the folks that we see try to access and identify when we're talking about identifying our deeper emotions and our experiences, shame seems like it comes up so much for folks. It seems to really be the root of lots of other things that people are experiencing, but truly to put a fine point and to get emotionally granular about it, shame always seems to be in there, lingering some way, somehow.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, more and more as I'm working with people, I've really and this is just, my personal philosophy, so I don't know how other therapists might feel about this, but more and more I have people come in for this one thing and they're just telling me about like their history, their life or whatever. And it's usually like in the way that they talk about things or the way they talk about their experience, it's like I start honing in on some piece of them with their self-worth that they have a negative feeling about themselves. They're a burden or they're unlovable or they're never going to be good enough or whatever it is. And and then as you move through life and other things happen that are painful, they rub on those spots and then I feel like then there's a layer of shame above the hurt or whatever the emotion is related on that, but it always kind of goes back to that. And I think that, I mean, that's what I really am trying to work with people on is let's figure out where those areas are where you maybe don't love on yourself like you should, and let's heal those. And then that's going to make the other stuff on top a little bit easier.
And I want you to know that you can be as loud as you want on this podcast anytime.
Well, now let's get into what happens when we can't identify our emotions. So, have you ever been asked, how are you feeling? And you realize you don't actually know the answer? Maybe you sometimes seem a bit off, a bit socially off, or others have told you that you tend to keep your emotions to yourself. While we all might struggle from time to time to name what it is we're experiencing emotionally, especially in stressful or complex situations, it's also possible that these could be signs of a condition known as alexithymia. Though the name sounds clinical, it's a real and recognized trait that affects roughly 13% of people. People with alexithymia have an ongoing difficulty with identifying and putting into words what they're feeling emotionally. Rather than simply being tongue tied in the heat of a moment, someone with alexithymia may consistently find it hard to connect language with their emotional experiences. Research isn't conclusive as to why some people experience alexithymia, but some possibilities include traumatic brain injury or trauma. And while this episode doesn't focus on alexithymia, we felt it was important to mention this condition and encourage you to seek support from a mental health provider. Let's shift to what happens when we can't identify our emotions on a more general scale, or when we try to ignore them altogether. There are a variety of reasons that can influence our willingness or ability to share our emotions too. Similar is named above, and even our cultural messaging that suppresses emotional awareness. We live in a society that doesn't teach us healthy ways to validate and honor emotions. So sometimes we default to pushing them away when they arise, and this can really wreak havoc on our mental health. Let's talk about some common ways people avoid emotions without even realizing it. Jennifer, what have you seen either in yourself or others?
I was just thinking about this and what I've seen a lot of folks do in a physical way of avoiding emotions, I see a lot of folks turn to things like food for comfort, right? But I've also seen folks turn towards, in an expression kind of way, anger, right? Anger very frequently seems to be the emotion folks easily or readily identify as what they're feeling and experiencing, or even like expressing outwardly to others. But beneath that, there could be a well of other things like deep sadness or grief, right? Fear. That's, I think those are really the two that come to mind.
I feel like something that I've seen a lot, I guess both personally and professionally, is the emotions that come up when someone is sharing their emotional experience with you, or they're maybe sharing something like a hurt or something that they want to express to you to feel heard and validated and all of that. And when anyone expresses that kind of stuff to us, it definitely causes emotions within us. Like maybe we feel some shame or whatever. And something I've noticed, people who want to avoid emotions is they either shut down the conversation, or they may flip it and get angry at the person and turn it into something else. So I think that can, especially in relationship, can be really tricky.
Yeah, I think you're right. And too, I mean, it's such a great point. If we are having difficulty or we're avoiding experiencing our own emotions, it can make it that much more difficult to be able to tolerate the distress of experiencing or hearing other people's emotions. And there is a link between our ability to empathize and our ability to give kindness and be open and vulnerable with ourselves and what we're experiencing and feeling.
My sister sent me a meme that said, which I've seen a bunch of, I'm sure everyone has seen these, where it's like you're telling your mother the hurtful things she did to you during childhood, and her response is, "Well, I'm sorry I was such a terrible mother." Because I think sometimes part of avoiding emotions is not even just avoiding your own emotions, but avoiding experiencing someone else's emotions, because that can be uncomfortable. And I think part of the whole thing with emotions is also our tolerance for discomfort or distress, and being okay. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. It's not going to be uncomfortable forever, but it sometimes in the moment feels that way. And so it's like I feel like that fuels a lot of people's avoidance. So allowing ourselves to experience and move through core emotions rather than suppressing them or covering them up with avoidance strategies is really essential for our emotional well being. And when these emotions are blocked, the energy they generate can remain trapped in the body, and that really contributes to stress and discomfort. In contrast, releasing that emotional energy frees us to engage more fully with the world around us through meaningful work, fulfilling activities, and authentic connections with others, instead of using our inner resources to keep those emotional defenses in place. And as we become more familiar with our emotional experiences and learn to tune into them, we initiate a process of healing. So, recognizing and naming emotions helps integrate the brain, the body, the mind, which can lead to a greater calm, increased self confidence, improved adaptability, and enhanced overall health. By increasing our emotional awareness through recognizing and understanding our emotions when they arise, we can manage them rather than being controlled by them. And understanding our emotions can help prevent us from acting impulsively and respond to our feelings with greater compassion and kindness as well.
So now let's look at how identifying emotions directly improves our communication. When emotions go unnamed, they don't go away. They just find sneakier ways to show up, what psychologists sometimes call emotional leakage. Now, that might look like snapping at a coworker when you're actually anxious about a deadline, or withdrawing from your partner because you're feeling ashamed, but you don't know how to say it. When we struggle to identify what we're feeling, it becomes really difficult to communicate that to someone else. And this can create misunderstandings, broken trust, and disconnection. And these miscommunications compound when we're talking about our relationships. So, for example, if your partner says, "What's wrong?" and you say nothing when there is something wrong, you're not protecting them from conflict. You're actually closing a door to understanding. So imagine this scenario. You come home from work, you're feeling irritated, kind of snappy. Your partner asks an innocent question, and you reply curtly. You're annoyed. Later, you reflect and you realize you weren't actually mad at your partner. Maybe you were embarrassed about something that happened at work, and then you carried that feeling home. Now imagine an alternate reality where you came home, you took a moment and said, "Hey, I had a really rough moment at work today, and I'm still feeling off. I might need a few minutes to reset." Think about which version creates more connection between you and your partner. Being able to name your feelings gives you the power to choose your next move. And it gives other people a window into your experience rather than leaving them guessing or assuming the worst. Research by Dr. Barrett, who we mentioned earlier, found that emotional clarity is positively correlated with interpersonal satisfaction and empathy. Greater emotional clarity helps people regulate their emotions more effectively, which improves conflict resolution and emotional responsiveness in relationships. And we know that relationships thrive on emotional clarity. When we can articulate how we feel and why, we invite others into a deeper level of connection. Think of the difference between "you're so annoying" versus "I feel overwhelmed, and when you interrupt me, it makes me feel invisible." The second response here is vulnerable. It tells the truth about your inner experience, and vulnerability builds trust. And here's something that's important too: clarity doesn't mean emotional dumping on our partner. It's not about giving people your rawest, most unfiltered reactions. It's about learning to pause, reflect, and share what's real in a respectful way. And this does take practice, especially if you didn't grow up in an environment where emotions were talked about openly. Many of us, in fact, were taught, either directly or indirectly, that feelings are unacceptable. Maybe the message that anger is dangerous or that sadness is weak. Joy could have been modeled as self centered. If that's your starting point, it can feel very vulnerable and uncomfortable or even scary to say out loud, "I feel ashamed," or "I feel really proud of myself." But naming your emotions clearly gives others a chance to meet you in the truth of your experience. In relationships, this means fewer assumptions, fewer miscommunications, and more space for repair when things go wrong. So, whether you're a parent, a partner, manager, or a friend, being able to say, "I feel anxious and I'm working on it," can be more impactful than pretending you're fine while you're silently unraveling.
I feel like that bit of information brought up some emotional responses in me. I was specifically thinking about how, I guess this is related to like triggers and things, but like when you were talking about saying, "I feel overwhelmed, and when you interrupt me, it makes me feel invisible." And I was thinking about how being aware of your own emotional experience and communicating that, because a lot of times, like the way we react or the way we are in relationship with others, or the way we express ourselves, can be rooted in something else. And so sometimes I feel like even being aware of that and being able to communicate, like, this is what I'm feeling, like, oh, I recognize I'm doing this. This is what I'm feeling, whatever. Because a lot of times people trigger each other, but they don't talk about that, right? They don't talk about that. And I will give a personal example because I feel like it might be helpful. I'm one of those people that over explains, which you may be able to tell since I'm doing it right now. I over explain when there's like a serious conversation, even because I will explain how I'm feeling 10 different ways if I can. And it for me, I know it stems from growing up and being told who I was or what I thought, and the reality of who I was being denied, right? And so, and then always feeling misunderstood. And so, especially in partnership, in like romantic relationships, if my partner is telling me, well, you think this and you always think this, and it's almost always wrong, but this thing goes off where I'm like, well, they misunderstand me. So now, and so I do like interrupting is something I really struggle with because there'll be an expression of maybe not a judgment, but maybe that's part of the feeling that comes up, right? Is I feel judged, but or misunderstood. And so then in my mind, it's well, if I can over explain this, then there won't be this misunderstanding, which can be helpful to label it and say whatever.
I think that's a incredibly real experience for so many people in the context of close relationships or intimate relationships. And also it's very normalizing that you share that, right? Because I am positive there are, and self included, but so many people listening to this who are like, oh my God, the same thing happens to me, right? Because with naming our emotions and becoming clear with ourselves about what we're feeling and experiencing, I think a big part of that requires becoming aware of the lenses that we're viewing the people we're interacting with, right? And how we're viewing ourselves, which is so deeply tied to how we were treated early on in life, right? Because that stuff really sticks. And I think it takes so much work, so much effort, but worthwhile to do the work of identifying what that lens is and how it's impacting our ability to receive from others, but also, right, know the experience that we're having and find that truth too.
Well, and I think it makes it hard when you have an emotion come up, especially one that is rooted to something that's like super core to like the things, that were unsettling in childhood, because it even then gets in the way of what I want to do is be emotionally open and listen to my partner, but like in the a wall that's created there is my own emotions. And so I think it is tricky sometimes to recognize, "Oh, I'm feeling this way, but in this moment, I wanna be present and make room for their emotion." And it's a skill like anything else, you have to work at it. Like, some people it takes some of us longer. Like, it's some days I'm really good at it, and some days I'm given a 10-minute monologue on why I feel like how I actually think or whatever. But I think that that is part of it is like figuring out how to realize, "Oh, this feeling's popping up for me. I'm not gonna ignore it, I'm not avoiding it, but I'm gonna put it over here right now so I can make room for their emotions, and then I can circle back and see, is this something I need to process on my own? Is this something that needs to be expressed to them?" And, that's obviously, like, way more beyond just identifying your feelings, but it is I do think that it is part of the whole process of, like, making room for everybody's feelings and figuring out the Tetris of feelings.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. Yeah, because that's a great image, right? A great metaphor for what we're talking about, right? Because it identifying our emotions is really like that first building block for that builds on, and because it's all a skill, right? And so building our skills so that we can be more authentic in the whole spectrum of communication, right? And the whole cycle of a relationship and how we're communicating. And so I think I love that. I love that.
Well, I think the other thing too about working on and being able to identify your emotions is sometimes when things pop up, it feels like super destabilizing and overwhelming, and it's like, "Oh, I can't do anything. This is happening." But if you were able to get to a place where you're able to take a second, be like, "Okay, what's going on for me right now?" Sometimes recognize, "Oh, this thing happened and I'm feeling this way about it." And sometimes it just almost deflates the balloon. And you're like, "Oh, okay, that's not really a big deal." Like, I see why that was feeling that way, and it's you move through it faster. So I think people avoid learning how to identify their emotions because of that big discomfort when you don't know how to do it that happens. But the reality is once you're able to do it, it can actually dissipate that discomfort in some cases pretty quickly. So now let's look at building the skill of emotional identification. How can we increase our ability to recognize and manage our emotions? So, here are a few practical steps that you can take. The first is to use a feelings wheel. So, you could start with something like Dr. Gloria Wilcox's feelings wheel and begin with the basic feeling: happy, sad, angry. And then you could work your way towards more precise language like isolated, humiliated, joyful, or serene. You can even print it out and keep it somewhere visible so that you can refer to it when you're feeling emotions and you're trying to work your way through identifying them. You could also journal with prompts. So you could try prompts like, today I felt most alive when, or the hardest emotion for me to name is, or even when I feel blank, I tend to act by blank. You can use I feel language in conversation. Practice with people you trust. Even if it feels clumsy at first, try, I'm noticing I feel whatever the emotion is, or when this happened, I felt. And I will say this. So, something I've noticed with people who struggle with identifying their emotions, if they're trying to communicate with someone in relationship that something happened, like they'll sometimes talk about their feelings by just recounting what they feel the other person did. Well, you did blah, 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 blah. And then, yeah, I understand that was your experience. What's your actual feeling? And I feel there is a struggle there because it's like, well, I'm telling you how I'm feeling. No, you're telling me what I did. You're not telling me the feeling. That's what I want to know is the feeling because that's what leads to understanding. But I've noticed that I don't know if you've noticed that. I feel like that's a common thing where it's, I'm going to tell you how I feel, but I'm actually just telling you what you did, which is not the same thing. And it's helpful, but not as helpful as knowing like this is how it affected you by naming the feeling behind it. Finally, you can practice name it to tame it. And we mentioned name it to tame it earlier in the episode. And here's how you can apply it real time. So, this phrase, coined by psychiatrist Dr. Dan Siegel, is simple but powerful. When we identify and label what we're feeling, we reduce the intensity of that emotion, which we actually just talked about earlier. Well, why is that? Because naming an emotion activates the brain's prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for reasoning and self regulation, and it calms down the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that triggers emotional reactivity. So, saying something like, I feel overwhelmed or I'm sad can actually help you to start to feel more in control. This isn't just about being self aware, it's also about self regulation. So, we talked earlier about how research shows that people who can accurately name their emotions are less likely to become overwhelmed, more able to communicate clearly, and better at resolving conflict. Well, applying name it to tame it is like turning on the lights in a dark room. You can see more clearly and choose your next step more wisely. So, next time a big feeling shows up, try this: take a pause, notice the emotion, and then ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? And try to be specific: anger, disappointment, shame, grief. Say it out loud or write it down. I feel, fill in the emotion. Take a deep breath and remind yourself naming the feeling is the first step to calming it. It may seem small, but this habit can have a big impact. You're not ignoring or fighting your emotions, you're working with them.
Adina, that's a great example of how to apply the name it to tame it skill. And I'm wondering, sometimes naming it to tame it can be really difficult in the moment when emotions are running high. It's not always second nature to folks. Do you have any tips on maybe what helps you remember to slow down to complete the name it to tame it?
I think that sometimes for me, if I start experiencing emotion and feeling overwhelmed, because if it's like a big emotion, I feel like I normally go to, if I haven't named it, I immediately feel overwhelmed by whatever it is. And then that can sometimes turn into anxiety. So, in an attempt to self-regulate, as soon as I start feeling usually in my body, and that's what I recommend to people too. If you are an anxious person, start recognizing when you feel it in your body, because sometimes that happens before it gets to your brain. And that's can be your clue to take a minute, focus, all those things. So when I start feeling, oh, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'll be like, okay, what's going on? It may not be surprising that since I talk a lot and loud, that I also talk to myself. I do it when I work and I do it when I'm overwhelmed. I'll say, okay, what's going on? What's happening here? Sometimes it's not immediately clear to me. So I'll even think, what has just happened? What are the things that just happened? What conversations did I have? What email did I open? What is it that has happened? And then sometimes by retracing my steps, I'll be like, oh, that kind of bothered me. What bothered me about that? Oh, I'm feeling this way. And then it's to me, sometimes it's like putting together a puzzle or even one of those hidden object games where you're like searching for the thing. But for me, sometimes it is like retracing my steps, because if I can figure out what it was that triggered the thing, then I can help name the thing, and then that helps me dissipate it, if that makes sense. It's a very wordy explanation.
Oh, that's great. I definitely understand what you're saying too. And I love that you pointed out, right, using your body as a cue and the sensations or just noticing there first. So I feel like for a lot of folks, that is where it's going to show up first, right? So, and I can relate if I am experiencing a very big emotion, usually I'll start feeling like my heart rate increase, right? Or I'll notice that my hands are particularly sweaty and moist. And so that's kind of become the cue for me to, this is a moment where it would help to really try to pinpoint what exactly it is I'm feeling, right? Because there have been times in my life where I just feel off, right? But it's not quite as helpful as really digging in and saying, okay, it's more than that, but what is it really, right? So I just love that idea of going to our body first and seeing what we're experiencing and making that our cue. Take a moment and do the deep dive exploration on our emotions.
So the last thing that you can do to help you to build the skill of name it to tame it is to talk to a therapist. So if you find yourself feeling numb, blocked, or unsure about what you feel, therapy can help you reconnect with your emotional experience and build some language around it. And remember, this is a lifelong skill. You don't have to get it perfect. You just have to stay curious. And I think that curiosity piece is super important, not just personally for yourself, because it helps you to really know yourself and to know your needs and emotions and everything, but also in relationship with emotions, staying curious about what someone's experience is and asking questions, and that really helps you connect, know the other person, and for them to know you as well, which can help with your emotions. So, as we wrap up, what would we say to someone listening who feels unsure where to start with all of this?
I would say curiosity. It can be, as we've talked about, really intimidating to start exploring our emotions, right? And getting deeper with that. It can be really intimidating to feel and try to connect with other people's big emotions too. And I mean, to the point where it can feel impossible. And if it's not something that you have developed the skill of, it can feel really not intuitive at all, right? And there's lots of reasons for that too, right? You could talk about neurodivergency and different things like that. All of these things can impact how do we relate to others and their emotions and how do we figure out our own. But I think curiosity is a great place to start.
I agree. I think something I've been using a lot with some of my people who are feeling anxious all the time, or they feel like they wake up anxious or whatever else, is ask them to start using a mood tracker and to start noting when they start feeling anxious. And then, even if they don't stop and look at it and dive into it right then, jot down what are some things that have happened over even the last 2 or 3 days before that, because sometimes there can be a delayed effect, right? Something happens, we're keeping it moving, we're doing the things, and then we have a moment of quiet, and then our brain's like, "Oh, remember that thing happened 3 days ago? We are upset about it," you know? So, I think that can be helpful into is to stay curious, but also, like, pay attention. Pay attention to yourself and then also giving yourself the grace to take your time with it. Don't feel like, "Oh, well, I have to figure this out right now." No, life happens, and so maybe later that day when you get home, you can take 5 minutes and try to figure it out, but and I mean, I've had people who come in and say, "I don't know anything about how I'm feeling or how to do it," and they will print out feelings wheel, or sometimes there's like different things where it just has lists of every type of emotion, and then they will literally search the list and say, well, this happened and I felt not great, and so I think this is how I was feeling, and then they can either journal about it or bring it to session. But I think everybody grows up differently, and sometimes avoiding emotion is an act of safety. And so I I think learning that we don't need to survive anymore now, we need to thrive, and learning how to do those things is so much better for us. So, start slow, take it piece by piece. So, I would just say as we wrap up that this is a lifelong skill. This is something that most people don't come out of the womb knowing how to do, and if you've not grown up in an environment where your parents expressed emotions in a healthy way and modeled all these things, most likely you struggle with it to some degree, or it shows up in ways where you have to work through it and it's a little bit harder. And I think that's true for most of us. So just remember that your emotions are data, not directives, and learning to name them is a great first step in learning to live well with them and in being able to really deflate that discomfort and not feel paralyzed by it, because it can feel like that sometimes. But if you have any questions or comments, please email us at dhbhs.media@hitchcock.org. And I'll also, in the show notes where we put the sources and everything, I'll also put some links for a feelings wheel. And I believe I may have also seen like a feelings map similar to what I was talking about, like putting the pieces together where you can like trace back what the kind of trigger for that feeling was. So I'll put some links in there under helpful things before the resources for anyone who wants that information. And we so appreciate you listening, and we hope you have a wonderful day.